So I have a little bit of a conspiracy theory here, and that is really all it is. I don't mean to stipulate what I am about to go over as fact, but I do think there is a whole lot of correlation for there to be absolutely no causation. So consider what I am about to say a conspiracy theory or a hypothesis that has yet to go through the scientific method, and what we have is the idea that maybe, just maybe, the meteoric rise of the fantasy genre had something to do with the downfall and depopularization of the classic sci-fi genre, or the sci-fi genre as a whole as we knew it, because it had to adapt and evolve to keep up with this new character-based fantastical genre that had seen such an epic rise to stardom. Now, by no means am I claiming the fantasy genre is evil or bad. As you all know, I am a massive fan of the genre and have spent a large portion of my life reading it. That being said, looking back at the history between the two, one seems to rise as the other falls, but let's go ahead and jump on deeper into it. The heyday of the classic sci-fi genre is largely to be considered between the mid to early 1950s and the mid to late 1960s. During this time, you had authors like Isaac Asimov, Heinlein, and Niven cranking out these classics that still echo in our society today. The Twilight Zone and Star Trek began their roots during this time, and overall it seemed that interest in science was at an all-time high. You can trace this back to recent events that happened in society. Sputnik was in the headlines. Polio had just been cured. Science was the thing. Everyone was amped up to read about these new inventions, these new ideas that were coming forth, and that bled over into our fiction. People wanted to know how far you could take these ideas, and these wonderful, brilliant, beautiful authors crafted incredible stories, taking these ideas and stretching them to their fruition. We had things like iRobot examining AI and the meaning, the impact that would have on our life. Ringworld, which I recently reviewed, plug here, told us about an entire planet that's a ring around a star, man-made. Could we do that? Was that feasible? Childhood's End, my personal favorite that I've read from the genre so far, asked maybe the most important question of all. Are we really in charge of our own future, or could things be so beyond, so outside our own understanding that we are more like children wandering in a forest at night, unable to truly comprehend the reality around us and the dangers that could exist a mere cosmic step away? I want to reiterate that Twilight Zone was coming out during this time, maybe the most important scientific piece of media to ever exist, and it totally holds up today. And yes, Black Mirror is wonderful, but it owes all of its influence back to this magnificent, perfect, incredible series, The Twilight Zone. But what changed, you may ask? What could have possibly caused the mostly younger, college age and below audience to switch from science fiction to fantasy? Well, during sci-fi's heyday, a very important book was released, the most influential Western fantasy book of all time, The Lord of the Rings. And yes, it came out during the middle of the sci-fi heyday, but its influence slowly grew and built, and copycat authors began to emerge. Copycat not in a bad sense, but in the best of sense. People who were inspired by their childhood wonder to craft their own Lord of the Rings and produce these great fantastical worlds, and slowly the attention was pulled away from these scientific ideas from these young minds with awful attention spans, and this results in the rise of the fantastical genre, the fantasy genre, and we begin to see more character-based worlds with these magical elements to becoming the forefront of media and fictional writing. What really solidified its place, what was the death blow for the classic sci-fi genre, was the release of Dungeons and Dragons in the early 70s. Now kids could not only read these great journeys and adventures, but put themselves in these worlds with characters they created. Now you may ask, Daniel, you were only born in 1994. How could you possibly know the cultural and economic impact of Dungeons and Dragons? And I will come back at you saying I have a first-hand source, an old man who lived through it all. He was reading those sci-fi books the years they were released and continued with fictional reading until fantasy came to its popular position and dominated fictional writing. My father, the man who absolutely participated in all of this, the OG nerd of my family and the person who influenced me to be such a voracious reader, Mark Greene, coming in strong. Now, he specifically told me, wait, I need to sound like Alex Jones here for a second. As the kids were pulled away from their science fiction and began to read these fantastic Dungeons and Dragons manuals, if you may, they forgot their roots of examining things through the eyes of a scientific lens and began to examine things in these more fantastical lighting and eventually turned the frogs gay. Whoa, sorry, I got consumed by the Alex Jones character there. It's a powerful tool and something that should be wielded carefully. The Alex Jones class is a much later addition to the D&D manual. Now, if you want further proof my dad knows what he's talking about, these pictures are showcasing his D&D collection he built up through the years of him playing through high school and college with his friends. These are original pieces, manuals, and basically enough information to craft a world as thoroughly well done as Middle-earth. I'm not even joking. He has a character named Loki, which reached levels I can only dream of within the D&D world. I do not have as much time as people did back in the 50s. There's things like the internet and Reddit, but fortunately for my dad, he was raised in a time where pizza, booze, and board games were how friends got together and bonded, and his friends group's board games choice was almost always Dungeons and Dragons, and it was so much fun when my dad gave me his old collection of D&D stuff and I was able to go through and kind of peek into the worlds that he and his friends crafted. It was wonderful and awesome until I found a character sheet with the name Daniel on it. Dad, am I named after one of your D&D characters? How did you get that past Mom? Dad? But why, you may ask, in the early 70s did a bunch of old bearded men suddenly have the creativity to make these fantastical creations? Where do you think all the hippies who did acid went? Are you telling me it was a sober man who came up with the idea for a world on the back of a turtle with elephants holding it up? You owe your fantasy elements to hippies who did acid. Worship these wise wizards. The fantasy genre now began to heavily influence sci-fi in general. Now sci-fi was much more character-based and influenced. These high science ideas were no longer at the forefront of the plot. By no means was this a bad thing. I absolutely adore hokey, campy sci-fi that was prominent during this time, but fantasy's place on top was sealed in the late 90s when the Lord of the Rings movies were released and financially obliterated any previous science fiction-based movie. Now fantasy was seen as a financially viable way to capture an audience in the movie forefront, and as movies and TVs go, we usually see literature follow in today's day and age. Yes, there have been great sci-fi shows and occasionally a great sci-fi book since then, but mostly fantasy has been at the forefront, and the sci-fi that is successful is still incredibly heavily influenced from the more character and experience-based fantasy genre. It's not about taking a high science idea, it's about immersing the reader in an incredible experience through science. The most popular sci-fi book of the last 10 years was The Martian by Andy Weir, and while this book certainly goes against many modern trends for the sci-fi genre and does have a more dry scientific lens, Andy Weir is still pretty much penning a character piece that is much more about the feeling, the isolation of living alone on Mars. It's not about whether AI will change our future forever. It's not about what are we gonna do once we start running low on resources, or if an alien race has any influence over our future. No, he is simply examining how a man could survive on Mars, something that has some basis in the classic sci-fi genre. Echoes still exist, but certainly not nearly as focused on the ideas, much more focused on the character, which again is not a bad thing. The Martian is a great book and a wonderful experience. It's just sad to see classic sci-fi's adherence to ideas and exploration of ideas no longer having any prominence within our fiction at all. Thank you guys so much for listening to my little conspiracy theory rant ramble. It was inspired by my dad and I having a phone conversation where we were talking about how it seems strange these two timelines matched up the way that they do do, and we kind of just shot this shit back and forth until we developed a little conspiracy theory of our own. By no means is this meant to be a legitimate thing. It's just a fun idea we tossed back and forth, and it could have some basis in truth, or it could just be a total quack theory, but it was absolutely a blast to do. Thank you to my dad for letting me showcase his D&D stuff here and actually giving to me in the first place. I'm still grateful for that. It's one of my most prized possessions, one of the best things I'll ever inherit. I love it, and I appreciate you guys having a little bit of fun with me in this video. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support the channel and what I do here, and let me know what you think about this kind of series of events, because I may have over-exaggerated some of the correlation here, but honestly, surprisingly, not a lot. They really did seem to rise and fall to opposite each other, kind of these trends clashing a little bit. Let me know what you think. Have a good one, y'all. I hope you're having a great day, a great start to your weekend, and a great week ahead of you. Peace.